Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. I just have a few questions with regard to this bill. And initially, this kind of came down the pike relatively quickly in the past week or so. So can you tell me how this bill came about and why we have to vote on it today?
Through you, Mr. President. This bill came to the Senate via the governor. It's a gubernatorial program bill.
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
Thank you, Chairman. And did the governor explain why it was necessary that we do this? I understand it came out as a program bill, but it seems like this may constrain the governor to some extent or provide her with kind of a shorter list, and we'll get into that in a little bit, in the event that she were to exercise this authority.
Yeah.
Well, we have the bill before us, and I can only infer that the governor sees this as expanding her options in terms of appointing a new chief judge. Just to say that this bill would only take effect when an associate judge is confirmed to be a chief judge, which is a very rare occurrence. It doesn't compel her to choose an associate judge from the same list as a chief judge, but it does give the governor that option. The last time an associate judge became chief judge was before Senator Gonzalez was even born, 1993.
Yield for another question, please.
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
Thank you. And just so it's clear for our body, because I think there's some nuance for the non-lawyers, or even for many of the lawyers, there are associate judges, of course, and then there's a chief judge. Could you explain to us what the chief judge does with respect to their duties relative to just an associate judge on the Court of Appeals?
Chief judge is not just the head of the Court of Appeals and essentially will control the court in determining who writes opinions, but also is the CEO of the entire New York court system. So the position is incredibly important, and to have a vacancy at either the chief judge level or the associate judge level is cause for concern, since Chief Judge DiFiore, the former chief judge, resigned, which was 7 months ago. The court has decided over 50 cases and many more, presumably, motions and applications. It's really impossible to know how many cases have been delayed or were passed over because the court is waiting for that seventh judge. And these issues obviously have significant impacts on litigants and courts statewide, who need to know how to interpret the laws that we write in this chamber.
Will the sponsor yield for another question, please?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes, that wasn't me saying no.
The sponsor
That's
yields.
pretty, I would have said that was very impressive if it was you. It would have been outstanding.
First amen chorus.
Yes. Very Caesar-like, right? You can get a yes or no with it. So in that regard, I think we can agree that the chief judge is almost not a completely different position, but they have a tremendous amount of additional duties relative to associate judges. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Thank you. Would you continue? It's amazing. Are they watching? They might be watching. Chairman, would you yield for another question?
Brought those folks here.
Why don't they do it when I'm speaking? Would you yield for another question, please, Chairman?
Will the sponsor yield? The sponsor yields.
Yes. Thank you. So in that regard now, we have a list before us in our committee, the Judiciary Committee, that has 7 potential nominees, and the Constitution prescribes how that list actually is made. And could you also explain to us how someone gets on that list? Are they chosen out of the sky, or do judges, sitting judges, or lawyers, or people who are otherwise qualified, is there an application process when the list is, or when there is a request for a list and there's a vacancy on the Court of Appeals?
Yes, there's an application process with a Commission on Judicial Nomination comprised of members, various appointees from the governor, the Court of Appeals, our own chamber, your leader, the Assembly, and the Assembly Minority Leader.
Thank you, Chairman. Would you yield for another question?
Will the sponsor yield for another
Yes.
question? The sponsor
Yes.
yields.
So in that regard, this commission creates the list, and as prescribed in the Constitution, the governor has to choose from that list in order to obviously nominate someone, and then they go through the process through the Judiciary Committee and then to the floor. Is that the process? Would you yield for another question, please?
Will the sponsor
Yes.
yield? The sponsor yields.
So in that regard, if this were to become law, the governor would then, and just so we can explain the mechanics to our colleagues, there are currently 3 associate judges on this list of 7, right? Judge Canatero, Judge Troutman, Judge Wilson. If the governor were to select one of those 3 for chief judge, and they were ultimately confirmed, that would then create still 6. There'd still be a vacancy now as far as the associate judges are concerned. Is that correct? Would you yield for another question, please?
Just,
Yes.
just as a reminder, I just want to make sure that when you're asking the sponsor yields, if we cannot have conversation through members, please
Sure,
request
Mr.
that.
President, of course. All my questions are through you. It's just
you.
habit to look at Chairman Horman, but absolutely
I
through
just,
you, Mr. President.
just as we prepare for budget debate, I just want to make sure that we're in the right state of mind, Senator Palumbo. Senator Horman, do you yield? Horman, do you
Through you,
yield?
yes.
Sponsor yields.
Thank you, Chairman. So with that in mind, in the hypothetical situation, Mr. President, that the governor does choose one of the sitting judges, in fact, for an associate judge position, the other 2 would be precluded from being considered, of course, because they're already sitting judges on the Court of Appeals. Is that fair to say?
By definition, yes.
Okay, certainly. And through you, Mr. President, would the sponsor yield for
Will the
another
sponsor yield?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
Thank you. So, practically speaking, the governor would have 7 nominees to choose from now. And in the event one of the 3 sitting judges are chosen, actually the list is only 4, because there are 4 non-judges on the list. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it's true. I would, through you, Mr. President, I would point out that the governor has the option to request a new list. This does not preclude her requesting a new list from the Commission on Judicial Nomination. This gives her an option.
Thank you, Chairman. Will the sponsor yield for another question?
Will the
Please?
sponsor yield?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
So then what we're saying is the governor then would not only, she wouldn't have a list of 7, she could potentially have a list of either 4 or technically 11 if she doesn't choose to select one of the remaining 4, because we then would get a new list at the governor's discretion of 7 more. Is that accurate?
Through you, Mr. President, as we've seen with the Commission's selections for the list, sometimes those individuals are on 2 different lists. So it's possible that the current individuals who are on this current list might be on the new list if the governor so chooses, if and when we pass this legislation. So I'm not sure it would be 11, but it could be.
Okay. Through you, Mr. President, will the sponsor yield for another question?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
So, as far as the either the current list or a new list or wherever it works out, that is an exclusive list, correct? Because the commission creates the list, and the governor is required to only select from individuals on that list. So it precludes anyone else from being considered for the chief judge or any subsequent associate judge position. Is that correct? The judges, the governor is only allowed, I know it's almost rhetorical, because I think we know the answer. The governor may only pick from the select list that the commission produces, correct?
Through you, Mr. President, depending on whether the governor chooses the associate from the current list, if and when we pass this legislation and it's signed into law, or she asks for a new list.
Through you, Mr. President, would the sponsor yield for another question?
Will the sponsor continue to yield?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
So, Senator, I guess what it boils down to, and the rub that I'd like to maybe have you reconcile, if you could, is when this vacancy was, when there was a request for an application process, there were certain judges who may not have significant administrative duties, but are absolutely qualified to be associate judges. So I have a concern that this was a chief judge list. This was not an associate judge list. So can you reconcile for me whether or not this list was for either associate judge, the application process was for either chief judge or associate judge? Because we do have some presiding judges of the appellate divisions who have applied. We actually had one previously from the Second Department, Justice LaSalle. We know how that went. But they're judges who already have significant administrative duties, but they may not be a perfect fit for chief judge, but they would be a better fit for associate judge. Can you reconcile that concern, please?
Through you, Mr. President. First, I would argue that if an individual is on this list for chief judge, and they certainly, presumably, are qualified to be an associate judge on the Court of Appeals. But secondly, if in the governor's discretion she agrees with you, she can always ask for a new list to fill that associate judge position. Again, we're just creating a pathway for more options.
Thank you, Chairman. Through you, Mr. President, would the sponsor yield for another question?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
Thank you. And Chairman, since this is an exclusive list, and we did have quite an interesting time with the previous nominee, with Justice LaSalle, who would have been an historic appointment to the Court of Appeals, are there any Latino nominees on the current list?
Through you, Mr. President, not that I am aware, no.
Chairman, would you yield for one more question, please?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
In that same regard, are there any nominees of Asian descent on this current list?
Through you, Mr. President, not that I am aware.
Thank you, Chairman. On the bill, please, Mr. President.
Senator Palumbo on the bill.
So, Mr. President, I do appreciate the fact that this might possibly streamline the process because we have been operating with 6 judges, but we've survived. And this is something that is now trying to statutorily prescribe some very abrupt changes during a very difficult budget negotiation process, but abrupt changes to our Constitution. We just saw this movie, and it didn't end well. That we're manipulating the process for what I think are reasons that are untoward. That this is some sort of a deal that has to do with possibly picking 2 judges from one list. But let's slow down and actually try to follow the Constitution one more time. It proscribes specifically, I'll read the highlights. I need my glasses for this, I'm getting old. The governor shall appoint from among those recommended by the Judicial Nominating Commission a person to fill the office of chief judge or associate judge whenever a vacancy occurs in the Court of Appeals. We don't have 2 vacancies right now. We have 1. And if by chance we get another one, that occurs upon confirmation of a sitting associate judge to now become the chief judge. This list was created long before that confirmation process because that's going to happen sometime in the future. So, I understand this may have been a program bill. I don't like it. I don't like the way it smells, and quite frankly, it is 100% unconstitutional. This is an exclusive list. The governor's prescribed to pick from 7, and now she'll be reduced down to 4 in the event she picks a sitting judge, or can go with a whole additional 7. So now it's a pool of 11 instead of a pool of 7, as the Constitution dictates. So, Mr. President, I am very concerned about the reasons for this bill coming to the floor at this point, but I will be voting no, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you.